Yeah, still for a lot of people that were here for the inauguration, it was a surreal moment. A lot of people, Adam, obviously very excited by it. Others are saddened by it and concerned by it. You know, it wasn't much unlike the campaign itself. I mean, so much rancor and division caused by some of the things that Donald Trump said during the campaign. And on Inauguration Day, that played itself out in Washington, D.C. once again. There were peaceful protests. Others were more bent on disrupting the process and being destructive. But there were still a great many people, which Donald Trump identified early on in his campaign, that were here to support him. And you know, they came away feeling like, you know what, this guy's going to do something different. He's going to change things, and it can be debated, but they're convinced, his supporters anyway, that he's going to drain the swamp.
And Josh, you talk about the supporters and the people there. New Hampshire and New Hampshire people played a key role in this campaign and in making Donald Trump the president.
Yeah, you know, Adam, it's funny. We started covering Donald Trump back in 2011. Now, he's been talking about running for president now for a couple of decades, as early as the 80s. But 2011, you know, he started making some noise about it. So we decided, why not? Let's go down to New York, Trump Tower. He let us come down and interview him. And he talked about some of the same things that he had been, you know, making America great again. He hadn't quite coined that phrase yet, but talked about how China was ripping us off and America lost its footing in the world. No one feared us. Enemies didn't respect us. At the end of that interview, though, I remember him asking me, he said, do you think that people in New Hampshire will pay attention to this interview? I said, sure, it'll get some attention, but if you really want eyeballs, what you got to do is come to New Hampshire. A month later, he was in Portsmouth, and Adam, you were covering it as well. I mean, it was something that even with someone with a fraction of an ego would probably be inflated by, because the response that he got there had a lot of people thinking, including myself, that, you know what, he just might run back in 2012. When he didn't even go so far as to set up an exploratory committee. A lot of people felt like, well, this was a gimmick. So then we started talking about it again back in 13 and 14 of this year. A lot of people were skeptical, as was I. But the campaign started to build, and here we are. I mean, a lot of people that didn't believe this day would be possible, but Donald Trump is the next president. And you talk about those New Hampshire ties as well. One of the architects of his early campaign, Corey Lewandowski, New Hampshire native, he was with Donald Trump from the outset. His departure from the campaign, though, occurred just before the Republican National Convention for various reasons, some possible infighting within the campaign, a lot of rumors there, but he remained close, Lewandowski did, with Donald Trump throughout the rest of the election, and even on election night we were texting back and forth, and he said that he couldn't have been more pleased and proud and humbled by being a part of history. Another guy that got on a little bit later with the Donald Trump campaign, familiar with a lot of New Hampshire folks, especially in the political landscape, is Mike Biondo. He was a senior advisor after having been with a couple of other campaigns in this cycle, and we actually caught up with him earlier this week to talk to him about what this is like for him. All right, Mike, good to see you, and congratulations on everything. This has been quite a ride for you. You started this cycle with Rand Paul, moved over to John Kasich. When he dropped out, Donald Trump saw the value in bringing you on.
Well traveled.
Yeah, what is this like for you?
This is amazing. You know, this has truly been an honor of a lifetime. I mean, when you work in politics, I've been doing this now for 25 years, so to get to the point where this is kind of like our Super Bowl, I can't believe how humbled and honored I am to have my company be involved in this, and then to be asked to, you know, end up working for the White House and working during the transition. This has been just an amazing experience.
Which brings me to my next question. Senior White House advisor, I'm not sure exactly what the title would have been, but you decided not to take it. Why?
Well, my company, Right Voter, has been doing very well, and, you know, I live in New Hampshire. My wife lives in New Hampshire. My family's in New Hampshire. You know, it wasn't the right time for me personally. You know, I took a long, hard look at it. I mean, honestly, I started, you know, working on, you know, getting ready for the job. You know, I was down here working on the transition and the inaugural committee. And, you know, I really thought up until about 4 or 5 days ago that I was going to take it. And just, you know, I'm doing well right now. I love the state. You know, it wasn't the right timing for me. It was hard to turn down, but, you know, I love coming back to New Hampshire. I'm going to look forward to doing things there and around the country.
And Donald Trump obviously is delivering his inaugural address. A lot of things going on.
Yeah.
And a lot of people feeling different things. What do you think he needs to do in the first days? What do you think he will do in the first days?
You know, I think he's going to do the same thing he did on the night he got the nomination. I think he's going to talk about bringing the country together. You know, I think if you take a look at his transition and the people that he's brought together for this administration, I think he's doing all the right things to move this country in the right direction. Now, he's going to stay, you know, true to who he is, because that's who Donald Trump is, and that's who got him elected. And I don't think the people that want him to change that part. But I think if you take a look at who he's nominated for the different positions, I think he's done a very good job being inclusive. And I think what you'll hear tomorrow from him is a message that talks about moving the country forward. It won't get into a lot of policy, but it will be more about what it is we need to do to bring the country to the place that we need to be. And, you know, he's a great communicator, and I think he's going to do a very good job as Commander-in-Chief.
And for you, you're staying in New Hampshire. You made the decision not to come down to Washington. But that certainly doesn't mean that we've seen the last of Mike Biondo in presidential politics. Right?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I've been doing this for 25 years. My company, Right Voter, has been doing it for 4 years now. So, you know, we're excited. I mean, this was a long presidential cycle. I'm happy to come home. We're going to be doing stuff, working with the administration. You know, I've made a lot of friends. There are a lot of good people over there. So we'll be doing stuff down in Washington, D.C. We're doing stuff in New Hampshire. We'll do stuff across the country.
Best of luck to you moving forward, and congratulations on everything.
Thanks for everything.
Good to see you. That was Mike Biondo. A lot of people very surprised that he passed up the opportunity to be an advisor in the West Wing. But let's talk about New Hampshire's place in this particular process, this cycle. You know, Donald Trump, he didn't do very well in Iowa. You know, he had a third place finish. I think it was third or fourth place finish. At any rate, it was very disappointing. And a lot of people figured, well, okay, so, you know, this isn't going to happen for Donald Trump. Ted Cruz was surging. Marco Rubio came into New Hampshire. He was surging. But then, you know, talk about revitalizing and resurrecting a campaign. Donald Trump obviously won the primary, did so by a large margin, and just propelled out of the Granite State in the first in the nation, Adam. And obviously the rest, as they say, is history.
Hey, Josh, you've had a level of access with Donald Trump with those one-on-one interviews that not a lot of people have had. You've been up close and personal with him. What do you see in those attributes that you got to know in him as Donald Trump, the candidate, do you see carrying over into Donald Trump as president?
Yeah, a lot of people ask me this, and I remember we did a conversation with the candidate. This is the televised town hall that we did with all the candidates. And we walked into the room, and there's a room full of people there, as it is for every one of those tapings. And a couple of minutes before the cameras were turned on, it was a little uncomfortable. You could tell that the crowd, they weren't saying anything, but you could feel it. It was palpable. They were skeptical of this guy, and they weren't buying he was a legit candidate for president, much less a favorite to win the presidency. Over the course of the hour, though, something happened in that room to where when it was over and the taping was done, people were coming up to him and saying, "Mr. Trump, you've got to do this. You've got to run. This country needs you." Now, obviously, being in a room with someone and watching it on TV are two totally different perspectives. So if he can translate that or somehow, you know, figure out a way to get that kind of message and that kind of personal connection that he did in the room that day, you know, through the lens of a camera, well, maybe there's going to be some people that who were skeptics at the beginning that might be more willing to give him a chance. But there's no question about it. There's going to be people here that are just never going to believe in Donald Trump. And there are some serious questions about, one, qualifications, two, ability to lead, character is another question. But in this particular election, he identified a lethargic but very powerful group of this electorate that had had enough. They felt like their opinions had been muted by all the political correctness, and he personified a lot of their frustrations. And but now he's the leader of the free world. He's the leader of the United States, the 45th president of the United States. And you opened by asking me, you know, how it felt to watch this take place. And I was sitting with the photojournalist, our cameraman, Danny Ryan, and we looked at each other a couple of times, a little wide-eyed. I mean, it is surprising. I mean, we're talking about a real estate mogul and a reality TV star that somehow took certainly a lot of name ID, but translated that into a movement, a national movement that propelled him all the way to the White House. And, you know, it's certainly a remarkable story, just like Barack Obama did coming out of nowhere back in 2006 to becoming one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. Donald Trump has been for decades, but now he's in the White House after having been kind of more of a tabloid star more than anything else, Adam.
All right, Josh McKelvin in Washington, D.C. The unconventional candidate, Donald Trump, will now do battle with Washington down there. It'll be interesting to see and report on. All right, we'll be right back with news.